This is about it, and this is the blood, broken and poured.
Hey guys, welcome to this week's edition of our sermon follow-up video. We are in week 2 of our series Vineyard, and we're looking at all of these different aspects of the vineyard. And our anchor verse has been John 15. We looked at last week a little bit. This week we're talking about communion specifically, and the title of this sermon is Fruit of the Vine. Right? That's right. Good. Yeah. I'll make sure I get that one right. Yeah.
We're good so far.
So and it's a great series so far. A lot of exciting stuff. So like I said, we're focusing on communion this week. So Gordon, give us a little overview of that, and we'll run through some of these questions.
Yeah, I mean, so we do at Faith Christian Fellowship now, we do communion typically once a month. And one of the things that I've really sensed is the value of going a little deeper than sometimes we give ourselves time to do it, to go a little deeper into the subject of communion. Even using it for future instruction, for sort of one of those church practices, which certainly communion is one of the core practices of the church, that we take the Lord's table together as a fellowship of believers, that we should understand it. We should be able to articulate it in our own heart to ourselves. We should be able to maybe help other believers understand it on occasion when if we are ever asked by an unbeliever what is the significance of communion, just in general, that we are the ones who understand it, I guess in one sense the most.
Yeah.
It's clear to us why we do this. So this particular Sunday, what we're doing is, just like any other communion Sunday, we will take communion together, but it's a matter of teaching it in greater depth. And it fits the Vineyard series. It fits within that so perfectly because it involves that idea of the fruit of the vine. And so we're using it and going a little bit deeper than normal in this particular.
Yeah, it's good stuff. So the first question we have here, this is almost an icebreaker really, but I think it'll play into the rest of the questions, is what do you remember about the first time you took communion? Was it a somber thing or a celebratory thing?
Yeah.
Or maybe both?
Yeah, exactly. And that's just one example of how you and your group might wrestle through those first remembrances of communion for each person. One example is the somberness versus the celebratory. There's lots of other things that may come out as well when people start talking about their memory of it. Do people come from a tradition of taking it as believers, coming at the conclusion of some kind of catechism or some kind of formalized education that then you take communion at the conclusion of that, the frequency of which you would take communion growing up. If we have new believers who came to faith as adults, maybe their stories will be different on how they viewed communion. So it's really, like Kyle said, it's a little bit more icebreaker, a little bit more, again, conversation starter, but certainly within the thread of what we're talking about, communion.
Yeah, it gives a frame of reference as you go through. I remember the first time I took communion, I don't believe I was a believer. I was very close. I was right in that. I mean, I started going to the church but I remember the way they would do it is it was a pretty large church, 1,200-ish or so, and so they would pass out all the elements, right? But they didn't explain what we were going to do, so I'm like, I totally got this. And they handed out the wafer, and I think I just took it and ate it. I'm like, okay, cool, and I ate it. And then I looked up, and everyone else was holding on to theirs. But I'd already swallowed it, and I'm like, I guess I should pray about stuff right now. And then I look up, and everybody's holding it. So then when they were finished, they went up front, and the pastor gets up and he's gives a explanation, and then everybody goes to eat it. And so I totally was just like, put nothing in my mouth. Like, I put my hand up, people won't think.
Pocket lint.
So yeah, that's right. I just pulled out some crackers I had in my pocket and ate those. And the funny thing is, I brought a friend of mine about a month later after I did know what was going on, and he did the exact same thing. So anyway.
There's all sorts of. I mean, I think it can be fun. I mean, communion is I mean, I put it in there, somber and celebratory. It can be kind of a fun conversation. Communion is just one of those things that we don't probably talk about enough, and so this is a great opportunity to do that.
All right, second question. What does Jesus mean that abiding in him and him in us happens as a result of eating his flesh and drinking his blood? That's a good question. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, I think this starts to get a little deeper, right? It starts to sort of unpack the reality of what we're doing here when we take communion. John 6:56 is where we find Jesus calling to his disciples to say that if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you abide in me and I in you. And for some, it was offensive, shocking. Jews were not permitted to drink blood. The life of a creature was in its blood, and you're not allowed to drink that blood. And here Jesus is saying, eat my flesh and drink my blood, and you will abide in me, I in you, and you in me. And so, last week was our abide emphasis, really that John 15, that foundational passage that Kyle referenced. And so we want to abide. We want to abide in him. That was the heartbeat of last week. And so what does it mean to abide? Well, one element, or one important part of that is communion. And he says that by doing this, we are finding our abide, we're abiding with each other. At the bottom of your discussion sheet, you'll have a quote from basically a writer on the subject of the church and the different practices of the church, and Clowney is his name. And you'll see down there it kind of amplifies this a little bit, gives emphasis to it. Just reading here, he says, he is the true vine, and we are the branches. We feed on him. We draw life from him, and this vital connection appears in the eating and the drinking of the Lord's Supper. So we are speaking the truth of this intimate connection between Jesus and us through the practice of communion.
Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely.
Very straightforward.
Very cool. Third question there. It says, Paul says we proclaim the Lord's death every time we observe communion. What exactly about his death are we proclaiming?
Yeah.
That's a good one, because it brings a whole new, not new meaning, but it brings it all into context and helps us to kind of grasp the big picture.
Yeah. I mean, we basically are asking ourselves in this question, what exactly about his death are we proclaiming? We're asking ourselves, what does any of this really mean? And communion is this little pulling back of the curtains a little bit and seeing into what this is. And every time we take the bread and we drink the cup, what we're saying is that something has happened on our behalf that we desperately needed, but we could never have accomplished. The symbolism of the bread is being the body of Christ. The symbolism of the juice or the cup being the blood of Christ. Those should be ours, right? It's substitutionary. That's where we get this concept of substitutionary atonement. We get this idea of a substitute. He was the lamb. What was the lamb? Well, at the Passover and throughout the history of Israel, they substituted for the sins of the people. They substituted the blood of animals, and most importantly, that of an unblemished lamb. And so we're looking, when we hold those elements, we are looking at what should be our body and what should be our blood, but is not. And they are symbolism of his body and his blood. And so we're proclaiming that what needed to be done and could not be done by us has been accomplished by him.
Yeah.
And paying the penalty and healing, bringing healing through the body and bringing payment of sin through the shed blood.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And all the roots that has in the Passover,
Yep.
kind of brings that whole thing to light, and just, bam, it's right there. But that's a great way to look at it. You sit there, this should have been me.
Right.
It's kind of the picture there. So, yeah, very, very good. Fourth question there, what do you think Paul's unworthy manner means, and how might unworthiness look in our modern expressions?
Okay. So this comes directly out of 1 Corinthians 11, where he is rebuking them for how they are taking the Lord's. They're taking it this is one element, this is one way in which they're doing it unworthy, with a lot of profanity. If you know what profane means, we use it in the context of terms and words that we have, you use profanity. What it really means is that you empty a word of its significance, or you empty something of its true significance and give it nothing common. It's insignificant.
Yep.
And so in the case of the Lord's Supper, they were profaning the Lord's Supper. It was insignificant. It was common, and it is not common. And so Paul was speaking to that in 1 Corinthians 11, and he rebukes them, and he says that it cannot be treated in this manner, and we are not to take the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. So in your reading, you have 1 Corinthians 11, the account that Paul gives. So it's just a question of what is unworthiness. The first thing I think I would want maybe discussed among you all and an understanding, certainly on Sunday morning this gets touched on, is that the first level of unworthiness, I often do when I lead in communion, is encourage unbelievers. If there is a doubt of faith, if there's an unbelief that is present in the community of people that particular day, I always encourage as graciously as I can not to take, because that is the epitome of unworthiness, that we have not embraced what the meaning of the communion even is. So that's one element of unworthiness. That's not meant to be treated ungraciously. It's just that's what unworthiness is. Another is, for them, it was selfishness. And as you take the communion elements, the cup and the bread and the cup, that is the antithesis of selfishness. It is a perfect picture of unselfishness. And for the people in Corinth, they were denying each other the privileges that they should have been setting themselves to the back and putting everyone else ahead of them, and they were jockeying for a position of prominence and denying others their privilege. So it was selfishness. That's another example of unworthiness. And I'd say the last one that I would remark on is that we all feel like we're unworthy. I know that. When we're sitting, I am unworthy, it feels like, to take communion every day. I mean, we say that, and then we're like, well, what do you mean by we're unworthy? I mean, of course we're unworthy. Well, the beauty of it is the more unworthy we see ourselves, sort of like a vicious circle, the more worthy we now are to take it. And not in pride, but we recognize how unworthy we are to take it. And so in a backdoor sort of way, we are now establishing a worthiness to take it in our unworthiness.
Yeah.
It's a
It's
deal.
totally true. It's
Right.
that whole humility. Once you realize that you're not worthy, you have now become
worthy.
or closer to. You're
Yeah.
getting it more. It's just the removal of self in the
Right.
whole thing. It
That's
really
exactly
is.
right.
It's good.
We share in his love. This is the body, and this is the blood.
The old David Letterman.